By the time the elevator reached its floor, no one inside was injured. No one was thrown. No one was humiliated in any visible way. And yet the challenge had ended so completely that no second attempt was ever spoken of again. Witnesses later struggled to explain what they had seen, not because it was violent, but because it was quiet. In a space designed to restrict movement, one man did not fight the enclosure, he used it. The others entered with confidence, numbers, and expectation. They exited with silence, uncertainty, and the uncomfortable knowledge that nothing they believed about advantage had survived those 2 minutes. The elevator was not chosen. That detail matters. According to those who later spoke about it, the space was ordinary, one of those narrow lifts common in older buildings of the period. Metal walls, muted lighting, just enough room for several men to stand without comfort. It was not a place associated with confrontation. It did not announce itself as an arena, and yet its limits would define everything that followed. Enclosed spaces alter behavior before any movement begins. Shoulders turn inward. Foot placement becomes deliberate. Distance, usually taken for granted, disappears. There is no retreat that does not collide with another body. In such environments, techniques designed for open floors lose their meaning. What remains is structure, balance, and the ability to remain composed while compressed. Witnesses later remarked that Bruce Lee seemed aware of this long before the doors closed. There was no adjustment period, no scanning of the space as though calculating options. His posture did not change. He did not square himself or lower his stance. He stood as he always did, upright, relaxed, neither guarded nor exposed. The others filled the space differently. 4 men entering an elevator bring weight with them, not only physical weight, but expectation. Numbers create assumptions. They create confidence before anything has been tested. In close quarters, that confidence often grows louder, not quieter. Voices take on certainty. Small movements become exaggerated. The belief is simple. Proximity favors force. But confined spaces do not reward force. They punish excess. The elevator began its ascent. No announcement was made. No challenge spoken aloud. The moment was defined not by words but by the shared awareness that something had been brought into a space too small to ignore it. Those present later described the atmosphere as tight, not tense in the dramatic sense, but heavy, as though everyone understood that whatever happened would finish before it properly began. Bruce Lee did not claim the center. He did not step back either. He remained where he was when the doors closed, allowing the space to dictate alignment. This, too, was noted afterward. Instructors would later explain that control often begins with refusing to improve one's position artificially. Let the environment reveal itself. Elevators move vertically, but confrontations inside them flatten. There is no room for flourish. Arms cannot swing fully. Kicks lose reach. Balance becomes fragile. Any technique that requires preparation announces itself too early. Only what is efficient survives. Nothing had happened yet. That was the most unsettling part. Witnesses recalled that the silence grew longer than expected. No one rushed. No one filled it with threats. The challenges, by their presence alone, had already declared intention. Bruce Lee responded by doing nothing at all. When the doors closed completely, the rules were already different from what anyone expected. The elevator continued upward, and in that quiet ascent, before a single decisive movement occurred, the outcome had already begun to take shape. Those who later tried to explain the moment often returned to the same detail. The confidence did not belong to one individual. It belonged to the group. 4 men in a confined space do not need to speak to feel aligned. Their spacing, their angles, even the way they shifted their weight created a shared posture. It was not aggressive, but it was declarative. Presence itself became the statement. In many confrontations, that alone is enough. Most resistance collapses under the pressure of being outnumbered before any technique is required. This was not a formal challenge, nor was it staged for an audience. That distinction matters. There were no rules discussed, no expectations clarified. The authority the challengers carried came from assumption rather than agreement. They believed that numbers, proximity, and physical certainty would resolve the encounter quickly, if it needed resolving at all. Bruce Lee did not respond to that confidence in the expected way. He did not meet their posture with a mirrored one. He did not raise his chin or set his feet wider. His stance remained narrow, almost casual. To some observers, it appeared inattentive, to others, dismissive. In reality, it was neither. It was simply unchanged. Confidence often seeks acknowledgement. It grows louder when it is ignored. One of the men shifted forward slightly, not a step, but a redistribution of weight. Another adjusted his shoulders, occupying space that did not exist a moment earlier. These were not attacks, they were tests. Silent questions posed through movement rather than words. Nothing came back. Witnesses later said this was the first moment uncertainty entered the elevator. Not fear, but something subtler. The kind of doubt that arrives when a familiar pattern fails to trigger a response. In open spaces, dominance announces itself clearly. In confined ones, it must be confirmed. Bruce Lee offered no confirmation. His attention was present, but it was not focused in a way that could be tracked. He did not fix his gaze on any single individual. He did not follow each shift with visible readiness. Instead, his awareness seemed distributed, as though the entire space, not the men within it, was what he was reading. This unnerved more than direct confrontation would have. In group dynamics, responsibility diffuses. Each person expects another to initiate. Confidence becomes circular, feeding on itself while waiting for a spark. In that elevator, the spark never arrived. The challengers had brought certainty with them, but certainty requires friction to sustain itself. There was still time to retreat. The doors had not yet opened again. No one was trapped by force, only by expectation. To step back now would require acknowledging that nothing had been gained by entering together. That moment passed. The elevator continued upward, carrying with it a confidence that had not yet been tested, but was beginning to feel exposed. And it was in that exposure, before any decisive movement occurred, that the balance quietly shifted. The presence of witnesses did not announce itself. No one gathered. No one leaned in. And yet, the knowledge that others were aware of the situation pressed inward just as firmly as the elevator walls themselves. This was not a public demonstration in the conventional sense. There were no raised voices, no deliberate display meant to attract attention. But buildings carry memory. Doormen notice patterns. Hallways remember pauses that last too long. When several men enter a confined space with one individual and do not behave as strangers, awareness spreads quietly, without spectacle. Inside the elevator, that awareness manifested as restraint. No one wanted to be the first to make a mistake under observation. Not because consequences were immediate, but because reputation extends beyond the moment. A failed assertion, once seen, does not vanish when the doors open. It follows. Bruce Lee appeared unaffected by this pressure. If anything, the presence of witnesses seemed to simplify the situation rather than complicate it. Later accounts suggest he understood something fundamental. When eyes are present, excess becomes liability. Every unnecessary movement multiplies its cost. The challengers felt this as well, though less comfortably. Their confidence had entered intact, but it now carried weight. The expectation that something decisive would occur lingered, unsupported by any clear path forward. Each second that passed without resolution did not calm the space, it clarified it. The silence sharpened. The elevator's soft, mechanical hum became audible, marking time no one wanted to acknowledge. In enclosed spaces, tension does not rise evenly. It accumulates in fragments, small shifts, interrupted breaths, the decision not to speak. One witness later recalled that it felt as though everyone inside had become aware of their own balance at the same time, each person subtly recalculating what would happen if movement suddenly became unavoidable. Bruce Lee remained still, not rigid, not passive, still in the way of something settled. He did not perform readiness. There was no signal meant for the watchers beyond the elevator walls. His composure was not curated for memory. It existed for function alone. This too mattered. Performative confidence often dissolves when no audience is being addressed directly. The challenges, by contrast, were now carrying two pressures instead of one: the presence of resistance and the presence of record. Even without names or clear faces, witnesses transform encounters. They introduce continuity. What happens here will be retold. It was this realization, quiet, shared, and unavoidable, that altered the meaning of the moment. The encounter was no longer about asserting dominance within the elevator. It was about not being defined by what happened there. The doors remained closed. No one spoke. And in that pause, the tension reached its peak, not through escalation, but through the understanding that whatever occurred next would be remembered not for its violence, but for its clarity. What followed was brief enough that some witnesses later questioned whether it should be called a confrontation at all. There was no signal that marked its beginning, no sharp intake of breath, no raised arm, no audible cue that movement had been chosen. The change occurred quietly, almost beneath notice, as if the space itself had shifted rather than the people within it. Those closest to the moment described it the same way. Bruce Lee did not initiate action so much as remove options. In an enclosed elevator, space is the most valuable resource. He did not attempt to control it by force. He occupied it by alignment. His positioning altered slightly, not a step forward, not a retreat, but a subtle adjustment that placed him where movement converged rather than where it expanded. This mattered more than speed. One of the men attempted to close distance. It was not aggressive, it was instinctive. In open environments, closing distance asserts intent. In confined ones, it reveals imbalance. The attempt did not complete itself. There was no visible strike, no dramatic interception. Instead, the motion simply ended, redirected into stillness by contact that appeared almost incidental. Observers struggled to describe what they saw because it lacked familiar markers. No one was thrown against the wall. No limbs flailed. No sound announced success. What occurred was closer to interruption than domination. Bruce Lee's movements were economical to the point of being forgettable. He did not pursue. He did not follow through beyond necessity. Each action ended where it needed to, and no further. This was perhaps the most unsettling element for those watching. There was no crescendo to anchor memory. Another attempt emerged, not coordinated but overlapping. In groups, individuals often act in response to perceived gaps. In the elevator, those gaps closed before they could be exploited. Bruce Lee's awareness seemed to function as a perimeter rather than a point. Contact occurred, but it did not escalate. Pressure met structure and dissolved. Witnesses noted that he never raised his voice. He did not issue instructions or warnings. There was no verbal assertion of control. The absence of commentary made interpretation difficult. Without sound or spectacle, observers were left to rely on outcome alone, and the outcome was unmistakable. Within moments later, estimated at less than 2 minutes, the elevator returned to stillness. The challengers remained standing. No one was visibly harmed, yet their posture had changed. Shoulders that had entered forward now angled away. Feet that had sought positions settled into neutrality. Nothing further was attempted. Bruce Lee did not claim completion. He did not look to the doors as if waiting for release. He simply resumed the same relaxed alignment he had held before anything began. To an untrained eye, it might have appeared that nothing significant had occurred at all. But no one inside mistook it. The demonstration had not been about technique. It had been about elimination of excess, of opportunity, of belief. By refusing to display power, he had made it undeniable. The elevator continued its ascent, and with it, the understanding that whatever advantage had been assumed no longer existed. The moment after movement often reveals more than the movement itself. Inside the elevator, there was no immediate reaction, no anger, no renewed attempt, no verbal recalibration. What followed was quieter and more telling. The challengers did not separate dramatically from one another, nor did they close ranks. Instead, they occupied space differently, as though unsure how to stand now that their earlier assumptions no longer applied. Certainty does not usually collapse all at once. It fractures. One witness later described the atmosphere as strangely neutral, as if the elevator had reset to an earlier moment, but with everyone now aware of something that could not be unseen. The confidence that had entered first had not been defeated publicly. It had simply found nothing to act upon, and without action, it had nowhere to go. No one addressed Bruce Lee directly. This absence mattered. In most confrontations, even unresolved ones, there is an attempt to reclaim narrative through words, posture, or gesture. Here, that impulse failed to surface. The challengers did not test again, not because they were physically restrained, but because the internal calculation had changed. They were no longer measuring strength. They were measuring risk. Bruce Lee offered no closing gesture. He did not acknowledge completion or signal restraint. His behavior remained consistent, as though the encounter had been incidental rather than definitive. This continuity reinforced what had just occurred. The lack of contrast between before and after made the outcome feel inevitable rather than imposed. When the elevator slowed, no one shifted toward the doors early. No one rushed to exit. The moment was not being escaped. It was being processed. Witnesses later struggled to articulate why the encounter ended when it did. There was no clear stopping point, no decisive blow, no verbal surrender. What ended it was recognition. The challengers had learned enough to understand that continuation would not change the result, only clarify it further. That realization carries weight. When the doors opened, the group dispersed without coordination. Not abruptly, not in retreat, but with the quiet efficiency of people who no longer needed to prove alignment. Bruce Lee exited as he always did, unhurried, unremarkable in movement, untouched by the need to mark the moment. No one followed. Inside the elevator, nothing had been taken, no reputation damaged openly, and yet something fundamental had shifted. The challengers had not lost a contest, they had lost a framework. The belief that numbers, proximity, and intent could force resolution had dissolved without resistance. That kind of collapse leaves no outlet for reaction. There is no anger to discharge, no opponent to confront. Only adjustment remains, and adjustment, when unchosen, lingers. The story did not spread quickly. There were no photographs, no formal accounts. No recorded testimony offered at the time. What remained were fragments, remarks shared privately, references made in passing, moments recalled when discussing confined spaces, group dynamics, or the difference between knowledge and assumption. The incident was not preserved because it was dramatic. It endured because it resisted explanation. Years later, those who spoke of it did so carefully. They rarely began with Bruce Lee's name. They began with the space, the elevator, the way confinement changes the meaning of strength. Instructors would mention it when asked about numbers or disadvantage, not as proof of superiority, but as a correction. A reminder that advantage is situational, not cumulative. What made the account persistent was its restraint. Nothing excessive had occurred, no visible injury, no public humiliation. The absence of spectacle made exaggeration difficult. Each retelling remained measured, almost reluctant, as though adding detail would distort what had actually mattered. Bruce Lee himself never documented the moment. Those who knew him later said this was consistent. He did not collect encounters. He did not preserve demonstrations for legacy. What he valued was understanding, especially the kind that survives when there is nothing to display. In that sense, the elevator incident aligned perfectly with how he approached learning. Remove what is unnecessary, keep what works, discard the rest without ceremony. Over time, the story changed function. It stopped being about confrontation and became instructional. Teachers referenced it when explaining why techniques designed for open spaces fail under compression. Psychologists used similar dynamics to describe how confidence behaves when deprived of reinforcement. Martial artists cited it as an example of restraint, not because force was withheld, but because it was never overextended. What lingered most strongly was the silence. Witnesses recalled not the movements themselves, but the absence of escalation, the lack of sound, the way certainty drained from the room without being confronted directly. That impression proved difficult to forget. Many later admitted that it altered how they assessed situations involving numbers or pressure. Not immediately. Gradually. The challenges were never publicly identified. This too contributed to the story's endurance. Without names, the incident belonged to no one and everyone. It became less about individuals and more about conditions. A demonstration stripped of ego, preserved only through consequence. In later years, when Bruce Lee's influence expanded beyond martial circles, stories like this were often overshadowed by more visible achievements. Films, public demonstrations, recorded interviews, yet among those who valued control over performance, the elevator incident remained quietly significant. It illustrated something that could not be staged. That mastery does not announce itself. That dominance need not be aggressive. That resolution can occur without victory being claimed. By the time Bruce Lee's legacy was discussed in broader terms, the elevator story had already settled into its final form. It was no longer an event to be proven. It was an example to be referenced carefully, sparingly, and usually without embellishment. Those who heard it understood why. Nothing about it invited applause. Nothing about it demanded belief. It simply left a question in place of an answer. And long after the building itself changed, after the elevator was replaced or renovated, that question remained quiet, unresolved, and instructive. Not about how to fight in confined spaces, but about how little is required when understanding is complete.